The October wind rattled the windows of Baker Street that grey afternoon when Father Edmund Blackwell arrived at our door. His clerical collar stark white against the black of his cassock, his face bearing the unmistakable marks of a man who had spent the previous night in sleepless agitation. Mrs. Hudson showed him up with that particular air of respectful solemnity she reserved for men of the cloth, and Holmes, who had been slouched in his armchair, examining what appeared to be samples of tobacco ash under his magnifying lens, set his work aside and rose to greet our visitor. Father Blackwell was perhaps 50 years of age, silver-haired and dignified, with the bearing of a man accustomed to authority, but currently stripped of it by circumstance. His hands, I noticed, trembled slightly as he removed his hat, and his eyes carried the haunted look of someone who has witnessed something that fundamentally shook his understanding of the world. "Mr. Holmes," he began, his voice steady despite his obvious distress. "I come to you because the police have dismissed my concerns as either the work of common thieves or, worse, as some elaborate insurance fraud on the part of the church itself. But I know what I saw. And I know that what has been taken from St. Agatha's is no ordinary theft." Holmes gestured him to a chair and waited with that particular patience he reserved for moments when he sensed a genuinely intriguing case approaching. "Tell us everything, Father. Begin with what was stolen." Before I continue with this remarkable case, please subscribe to Detective Sherlock if you haven't already. Your support allows us to keep bringing these mysteries to you. Now, let us proceed. Father Blackwell gathered himself and began his account. St. Agatha's Cathedral stands in Southwark, as you may know, Mr. Holmes. It is not the largest or most famous of London's churches, but it possesses certain treasures that make it significant in the eyes of those who understand such things. Chief among these are the Jewels of St. Agatha, a collection of devotional objects that have been in the cathedral's possession for nearly 400 years. "Describe these jewels," Holmes commanded. "There are three principal pieces," Father Blackwell explained. "First, a reliquary cross of gold and silver, set with rubies and emeralds, said to contain a fragment of the true cross brought back from the Holy Land during the Crusades. Second, a chalice of Byzantine origin, adorned with sapphires and pearls, used only for the most sacred ceremonies. And third, most precious of all, the crown of St. Agatha herself, a circlet of gold set with amethysts and diamonds, made in Sicily in the 13th century and brought to England during the reign of Henry VIII when the monasteries were dissolved." Holmes's eyes had sharpened at the mention of such antiquities. "And these items were kept where, precisely?" "In the cathedral treasury, a vault beneath the main altar accessible only through a locked iron door to which 3 keys exist. I hold one, the bishop holds another, and the third is kept in the cathedral's safe, itself requiring 2 separate keys held by our senior wardens." "A formidable arrangement," Holmes observed. "Yet these items have been stolen?" "3 nights ago," Father Blackwell said, his voice dropping almost to a whisper. "I discovered the theft when I went to the treasury to prepare the chalice for Sunday's service. The iron door was locked, showing no sign of tampering. The safe above was likewise secure. Yet when I opened the treasury vault, the jewels were gone. All 3 pieces vanished as if they had never existed." I could not suppress an exclamation. "But, Father, if the doors were locked and showed no forcing—" "Precisely, Dr. Watson. The police inspector, a man named Bradstreet, examined the scene and concluded that either the theft was an inside matter, implying that I or one of my colleagues had stolen the jewels ourselves, or that I had fabricated the entire story to cover some ecclesiastical embezzlement. Both suggestions are monstrous. Holmes had risen and was pacing the room with that contained energy that always preceded his most intensive investigations. "Tell me about the keys, Father. Account for each one on the night of the theft." "My own key never leaves my person," Father Blackwell said, touching his chest where presumably it hung beneath his cassock. "The bishop's key was in his possession at his residence in Lambeth, confirmed by his secretary. The third key was in the cathedral safe, which was locked, and the two keys to that safe were with Wardens Hawthorne and Cornelius, both of whom were at their respective homes that evening and can provide alibis." "And yet the vault was opened," Holmes murmured. "Tell me, Father, were there any other unusual circumstances surrounding the theft? Strange visitors to the cathedral? Unexplained noises or sightings?" Father Blackwell hesitated, and I saw a flicker of something. Fear, perhaps, or embarrassment, cross his features. "There was one matter that I hesitated to mention to Inspector Bradstreet, as it sounds so fantastical. But since you ask directly, Mr. Holmes, I must tell you that for 3 nights preceding the theft, the verger reported seeing lights moving in the cathedral after it had been locked for the evening. When he investigated, he found nothing, but he swore the lights had been real, not reflections or shadows, but actual illumination moving through the nave, as if someone were walking with a lantern." "Did he hear anything?" "Footsteps," he claimed, and once, on the second night, what he described as singing, a single voice, female, echoing through the empty cathedral. When he called out, the singing stopped, and when he searched, he found no one." Holmes's expression had become one of intense concentration. "Father Blackwell, I should like to examine your cathedral this very evening. Can you arrange for us to have access to the Treasury Vault and the surrounding areas?" "Of course. I can meet you there at 8 o'clock after evensong. The cathedral will be empty by then." "Excellent. One final question before you go. Has anyone shown particular interest in the jewels of St. Agatha in recent weeks or months? Scholars, collectors, anyone asking unusual questions?" Father Blackwell frowned in thought. "There was a gentleman, perhaps 6 weeks ago. He gave his name as Professor Marcus Whitley, claimed to be from the British Museum researching medieval ecclesiastical metalwork. He spent considerable time examining the jewels, taking notes and sketches. He seemed entirely legitimate, showed credentials, letters of introduction. But now that you mention it, I never followed up to confirm his identity with the museum." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Most illuminating, Father. We shall meet you at 8 o'clock. After Father Blackwell departed, Holmes immediately sent a telegram to the British Museum, then spent the remainder of the afternoon in furious activity, consulting various volumes on medieval church treasures, examining maps of Southwark, and making cryptic notes in his commonplace book. When I asked what line of inquiry he was pursuing, he merely said, "Several, Watson. The case presents features of considerable interest." St. Agatha's Cathedral proved to be exactly as Father Blackwell had described, not a grand edifice like St. Paul's, but a respectable medieval structure with later additions, its stone darkened by centuries of London soot. The interior was dim and cold, lit by a few gas lamps that created more shadows than illumination. Father Blackwell met us at the side entrance as arranged and led us through the nave toward the altar. The cathedral's atmosphere was heavy with age and incense, the sort of place where centuries of prayer seemed to have soaked into the very stones. Our footsteps echoed on the worn flagstones, and I found myself instinctively lowering my voice, despite the emptiness around us. The treasury vault was reached through a small door behind the high altar, concealed by a wooden screen carved with images of saints and angels. Father Blackwell produced his key, a heavy iron affair of medieval design, and unlocked the iron door, which swung open with a protesting creak that spoke of considerable age and weight. Beyond lay a stone staircase descending perhaps 15 feet into darkness. Father Blackwell lit a lantern and led the way down into a vaulted chamber perhaps 12 feet square, its walls of bare stone, its air cold and still. Along one wall stood a series of wooden cabinets and iron-bound chests. In the center of the room, on a stone pedestal, sat an empty, velvet-lined case that had clearly once held the stolen treasures. Holmes immediately began his examination with that systematic thoroughness I had witnessed so many times before. He studied the iron door and its lock with his magnifying lens, examining every inch of metal for scratches or signs of tampering. He inspected the stone walls, tapping them at intervals, listening for hollow spaces. He examined the floor, particularly around the pedestal, for any trace of footprints or disturbance. He even studied the ceiling, where the stone vaulting joined in a series of ancient arches. "No forced entry," he murmured. "The lock is medieval but well maintained. It would require the original key or an extraordinarily skilled locksmith to open it without leaving traces. Yet there are no traces." "Then how was it done?" I asked. "That, Watson, is precisely what we must determine. Father Blackwell, show me the rest of the cathedral. I wish to understand its complete layout." For the next 2 hours, Holmes conducted a methodical survey of St. Agatha's. He examined every entrance and exit, every window and door, every passage and staircase. He paid particular attention to the crypt, a maze-like series of chambers beneath the main floor, where previous clergy and notable parishioners had been interred over the centuries. He studied the bell tower, climbing its narrow spiral staircase, to examine the mechanism and the access it provided to the roof. Most intriguingly, he spent considerable time examining what appeared to be an ancient well in one corner of the crypt, now sealed with a heavy iron grating. "This well," he said to Father Blackwell, "does it connect to any other structure?" "It once provided water to the cathedral," Father Blackwell explained. "In medieval times, before London had proper water supply. It has been dry for centuries and was sealed decades ago, when concerns arose about children or vagrants falling in." Holmes knelt beside the grating, studying its edges with his lens. "Recently disturbed," he said quietly. "See here, Watson. Fresh scratches on the iron frame, where something has been pried or lifted. And here." He produced a small fragment of cloth, caught on one of the grating's bars. "A piece of wool, dark blue, recently torn." Father Blackwell looked alarmed. "You think someone entered through the well?" "I think someone may have exited through it," Holmes corrected. "But that raises as many questions as it answers. Show me where this well would emerge at ground level." We climbed back to the main floor and went outside, where Father Blackwell led us around to the rear of the cathedral grounds. There, in a neglected corner near the boundary wall, stood an old stone wellhead, its wooden cover rotting and half collapsed. Holmes examined it closely, then peered down into the darkness below. "A shaft descending perhaps 30 feet, he said. "Iron rungs set into the stone, old but still serviceable. And at the bottom, presumably, access to the well system that connects to the crypt." "Father Blackwell, this well has been used recently. There are fresh marks on these rungs, oil or grease where hands have gripped them." "But even if someone descended into the well from here," I objected, "how did they open the treasury vault? The door was locked from the inside, the key accounted for." "An excellent question, Watson. One which requires us to reconsider our assumptions about how the theft was accomplished. He turned to Father Blackwell. "Tell me, Father, on the night the jewels were stolen, were you the first person to enter the treasury the following morning?" "Yes. I unlocked the iron door myself at approximately 7 o'clock. "And the door was definitely locked when you arrived?" "Absolutely. I had to use my key to open it." Holmes smiled thinly. "Then we are dealing with someone extraordinarily clever. Come, Watson, Father Blackwell. I have seen enough for now. Tomorrow morning I shall need to examine the cathedral once more in daylight, and I shall require access to your records of visitors and any correspondence with this Professor Whitley." The following morning brought a telegram response from the British Museum. They had no Professor Marcus Whitley on staff, nor any record of having issued credentials for the study of St. Agatha's treasures. Holmes received this news with grim satisfaction. As I suspected, our professor was conducting reconnaissance, familiarizing himself with the layout and security arrangements. Now, Watson, we must determine who he really was and where he has taken the jewels. Over the next 3 days, Holmes pursued several parallel lines of inquiry with that tireless energy he brought to cases that truly engaged his interest. He interviewed the cathedral's verger about the mysterious lights and singing. He examined records of recent visitors to the cathedral. He consulted with experts on medieval church treasures to understand the market for such items. Most significantly, he made several trips to Southwark, ostensibly alone, returning each time with new information, but refusing to explain his reasoning until the investigation was complete. On the 4th day after our initial visit to St. Agatha's, Holmes declared himself ready to solve the case. He sent messages to Father Blackwell, Inspector Bradstreet, and several other parties, requesting their presence at the cathedral that evening at 8 o'clock. When I asked what he had discovered, he merely smiled and said, "All in good time, Watson. I believe we are about to witness the return of the jewels of St. Agatha and the exposure of a most ingenious thief." That evening, as darkness fell over Southwark, a curious assembly gathered in St. Agatha's Cathedral. Besides Holmes, myself, Father Blackwell, and Inspector Bradstreet, there were also the 2 church wardens, Hawthorne and Cornelius, the verger, and, most surprisingly, a young woman I did not recognize, dressed in widow's black, her face pale and drawn with obvious distress. Holmes positioned us all near the high altar and began his explanation. "Gentlemen, Miss Thornton," he said, nodding to the young woman, "we are gathered to resolve the mystery of the stolen jewels of St. Agatha. The theft appeared impossible because the treasury vault could only be accessed through a locked door to which keys were accounted for. Yet the jewels vanished without any sign of forced entry. How was this accomplished?" He paused, surveying his audience with those keen gray eyes. "The answer lies not in the door, but in the well. Someone entered the cathedral's crypt through the old well system, accessed the treasury from below through a route we shall examine shortly, and departed the same way. But this raises an obvious question. How did they open the treasury vault's door to make it appear the jewels had been stolen from a locked room?" "They didn't," Father Blackwell said suddenly, understanding dawning on his face.
"They never opened the door at all."
"Precisely, Father. The door was never opened by the thief. It remained locked throughout. Yet the jewels were removed. How? Because there was another way into the treasury. A way our thief discovered during his reconnaissance visit as Professor Whitley." Holmes led us down into the crypt, past the ancient well grating he had examined previously, to a section of the crypt that appeared to be a dead end, its wall solid stone. Holmes ran his hands along the stones, pressing at specific points, until suddenly a section of the wall moved inward with a grinding sound, revealing a narrow passage beyond. "A priest's hole," Holmes explained as we stared in amazement. "A hidden passage constructed during the Reformation when Catholic priests needed to hide from persecution. I discovered references to its existence in the cathedral's oldest records, which I examined at Lambeth Palace. The passage leads directly to the treasury vault, emerging behind one of the wooden cabinets. Our thief found this same information, realized it provided perfect access to the jewels, and used it to stage his theft." We followed Holmes through the narrow passage, which wound upward through the thickness of the cathedral walls, until we emerged, exactly as he had promised, in the treasury vault, behind a cabinet that could be swung aside. "But Holmes," I said, "even if the thief could access the vault this way, how did he know about the jewels? And more importantly, where are they now?" As to the first question, our thief learned about the jewels from someone with intimate knowledge of the cathedral. As to the second, Holmes turned to the young woman in black. "Miss Thornton, would you care to explain, or shall I?" The young woman's face crumbled, and she began to weep. "I never meant for it to go so far," she sobbed. "Thomas convinced me it would be a harmless matter, that the jewels were insured, that the church would be compensated,
That no one would truly suffer. He said we needed the money to start our life together, that after his debts were paid, we could be married. I was foolish enough to believe him." Inspector Bradstreet stepped forward.
"Miss Thornton, you're saying you were involved in the theft?"
"I provided information," she admitted miserably. "I work in the church office, manage records and correspondence. Thomas asked me about the jewels, about security arrangements, about the treasury vault. I thought he was merely curious, interested in church history. I even gave him the cathedral's architectural records when he asked to see them, records that mentioned the priest's hole. I didn't realize he was planning to use that information to steal the jewels until it was too late."
"And this Thomas is?" Holmes prompted.
"Thomas Radcliffe, an antiquities dealer with premises in Holborn. More importantly, a man with substantial gambling debts and connections to several unscrupulous collectors, willing to purchase stolen ecclesiastical treasures."
Holmes produced a photograph from his pocket. "Is this the man who called himself Professor Whitley, Father Blackwell?" Father Blackwell studied the photograph and nodded slowly. "Yes, that is him. But Mr. Holmes, if you know who stole the jewels, where are they? Has this Radcliffe already sold them?"
"He has not had time," Holmes said with satisfaction. "You see, I have had Radcliffe under observation for the past 3 days. He has made no attempt to contact potential buyers or to move the jewels. I believe they remain in his possession, hidden in his shop. Inspector Bradstreet, if you would care to accompany me there now, I believe we can recover the jewels of St. Agatha and close this case." Within 2 hours, we stood in Thomas Radcliffe's shop in Holborn, surrounded by glass cases containing ancient coins, medieval manuscripts, and various ecclesiastical objects. Radcliffe himself, a handsome but dissolute-looking man in his 30s, stood in handcuffs while Bradstreet's constables searched the premises.
"You'll find nothing," Radcliffe said with false bravado. "I know nothing about any stolen jewels."
"Then you won't object if we examine your shop thoroughly," Holmes replied calmly. "Particularly the false bottom in that display case near the window, the one containing medieval religious items. Rather appropriate storage for stolen church treasures, wouldn't you say?" Radcliffe's face went white. Within minutes, Bradstreet's men had discovered the hidden compartment and removed the jewels of St. Agatha, carefully wrapped in velvet cloth, exactly as Holmes had predicted. As Radcliffe was led away, protesting his innocence despite the overwhelming evidence, Holmes turned to Father Blackwell. "Your treasures are recovered, Father. though I fear Miss Thornton must face consequences for her part in the conspiracy. She was foolish rather than malicious, but foolishness in such matters cannot be excused. Father Blackwell's expression was sorrowful. She will answer to the law and to God. But I am grateful beyond words for the recovery of these sacred objects, Mr. Holmes. The crown of St. Agatha alone is irreplaceable, not for its monetary value, but for its spiritual and historical significance. You have done the church a great service. Several days later, as Holmes and I sat in our rooms at Baker Street, I reviewed the case one final time in my notes. "It was ingenious of you to discover the priest's hole," I observed. "Without that, the mystery would have remained unsolvable." "Not at all, Watson. The locked room aspect was merely misdirection. Once I realized that the thief must have had another means of access, finding that access became a matter of systematic investigation. The cathedral records at Lambeth Palace were quite explicit about the priest's hole's existence and location.
Our thief simply beat me to that discovery. But he made the mistake of believing that knowing about it would protect him from detection."
"And how did you identify Radcliffe as the culprit?"
"Through a combination of observation and deduction. The false Professor Whitley had to be someone with genuine knowledge of medieval church treasures. His questions and observations, as described by Father Blackwell, were too informed to be mere play acting. He also had to have connections to potential buyers for such specialized stolen goods. A search through records of antiquities dealers with dubious reputations led me to Radcliffe. His gambling debts, confirmed through my contacts in certain unsavory circles, provided the motive. And his relationship with Miss Thornton, which I uncovered through careful inquiry among church staff, provided his means of gathering intelligence. The rest was simply a matter of catching him with the evidence. "The singing the verger heard," I said. "What was that?" "Ah, yes. That turned out to be Miss Thornton herself, visiting the cathedral late at night after realizing what she had helped make possible. She told me she had gone there to pray for forgiveness, singing hymns in the darkness. The verger heard her, but could not find her because she hid when he approached. A sad detail, really, evidence of her guilt and remorse." The case of the jewels of St. Agatha closed with Radcliffe's conviction and sentencing to 7 years' imprisonment. Miss Thornton, given her genuine remorse and lesser role in the conspiracy, received a far lighter sentence. The jewels were returned to their place in the Treasury vault, where Father Blackwell arranged for improved security measures, including the permanent sealing of the priest's hole passage. Holmes accepted Father Blackwell's thanks with his usual modesty, declining the church's offer of a reward, but accepting instead a small medieval prayer book as a memento of the case.
I noticed he kept it on the shelf beside his chemistry apparatus, occasionally taking it down to examine its illuminated pages. "The case demonstrated several important principles, Watson," he remarked to me one evening as we discussed the matter over brandy and cigars. "First, that the impossible often becomes possible when we question our assumptions about how something was accomplished. Second, that even the most clever thieves are undone by human weakness, in this case, Radcliffe's greed and Miss Thornton's guilt. And third, that the past often provides solutions to present mysteries. That priest's hole was constructed 400 years ago to save lives. In our time, understanding its existence saved sacred treasures." "Do you believe the jewels have genuine religious significance?" I asked. "Or are they merely valuable historical artifacts?" Holmes considered this question with unusual seriousness. "I am not a religious man, Watson, as you know, but I recognize that objects can carry meaning beyond their material value. The crown of St. Agatha, the reliquary cross, the Byzantine chalice. These items represent centuries of faith, devotion, and cultural heritage. Their theft would have been a loss not just to one cathedral, but to all who value the preservation of human history and spiritual expression. In that sense, recovering them mattered beyond the mere solving of a puzzle. The case remained in my notes as one of Holmes's most satisfying investigations, not because it involved spectacular violence or international intrigue, but because it demonstrated his ability to see through elaborate misdirection to fundamental truth, and because the stolen treasures were recovered intact, returned to their proper place in service of purposes larger than themselves. Years later, I returned to St. Agatha's Cathedral with my wife, attending a special exhibition of the recovered jewels. They were displayed in glass cases with explanatory notes describing their history and the dramatic story of their theft and recovery, with Holmes given prominent credit for their return. The crown of St. Agatha gleamed under careful lighting, its amethysts and diamonds catching and reflecting the light as they had for centuries. A young guide, explaining the history to a group of visitors, mentioned the priest's hole and the clever detective who had discovered how it was used in the theft. "The passage was sealed afterward," she said, "but a small plaque marks its location, commemorating both its original purpose as a refuge during religious persecution and its later role in one of London's most intriguing mysteries." I smiled to myself, thinking of Holmes and his pride in cases that preserved rather than merely solved, that protected heritage rather than simply identified criminals. The jewels of St. Agatha had been restored to their place, serving again the spiritual and historical purposes for which they had been created. That restoration, more than Radcliffe's punishment or Miss Thornton's redemption, was the true measure of Holmes's success in this remarkable case.